Good evening. I am Myra Gooden, President of FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. FLAIR's mission is to create and sustain a network to promote and publicize research and education relevant to the contributions, lives, impacts, and lasting legacies of America's First Ladies. As always, FLAIR is grateful to our inaugural institutional lifetime members that include American University, Rider University, the White House Historical Association, the Massachusetts Historical Association, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the National First Ladies Library, the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, the George W. Bush Institute, and our newest members, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Dole Institute. It is their support that makes programs like tonight possible. And it is my pleasure to officially welcome you to FLAIR's first program of 2023, an examination of the life and legacy of Julia Gardiner Tyler. Our moderator this evening is Elizabeth Thacker Estrada of the San Francisco Public Library. Other participants include Sharon Leahy, an independent scholar, and Christopher Leahy, professor of history at Kuka Park College.
Thank you, Myra, for the lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be with all of you today. I will be providing a brief and basic overview of Julia Tyler's era as an introduction to the presentation by Christopher and Sharon Leahy. Julia Gardiner, the future Mrs. John Tyler, was born in New York in 1820 during the post-Revolutionary War era of the early Republic. Julia lived in a time of transition as the elite revolutionary past receded and the antebellum or pre-Civil War era of the common man came into being. I will mention three aspects of antebellum society and culture that affected Julia Tyler. A narrow view of ideal womanhood emerged in the antebellum era. Separate spheres became a salient concept of the time. The public sphere of politics, government, and professional careers was man's domain, and the private sphere of family, home, and church was woman's realm. Known as the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood, this ideology held that white upper and middle class women were designed primarily for the roles of wife and mother, and were expected to cultivate the four cardinal virtues of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. The true woman would perform housekeeping, rear good children, and make her family's home a haven of health, happiness, and virtue, while society benefited from her performance of these sacred domestic duties. Religious literature and print media extolled these virtues. Next slide, please. The Industrial Revolution brought innovations in communications and printing, and the use of paper-making machines and steam-powered printing presses enabled newspapers to be printed faster and more efficiently. This and higher literacy rates and the affordability of penny newspapers led to an explosion in newspaper circulation in the 1830s and 1840s. The invention of lithography in 1800 allowed for the production of numerous prints from one illustration, including caricatures. Women who did not appear to conform to the confines of their sphere were caricatured. Julia Tyler, as will be discussed in the next portion of this program, was one of these women. Next slide, please. Manifest destiny, a term coined in 1845, the last year of the Tyler administration, was the belief that Americans had a destiny to settle the American West and to expand their control from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. This philosophy supported U.S. territorial expansion and was used to justify the forced removal of Native Americans from their lands. Rapid territorial expansion aggravated sectional tensions over the spread of slavery as new states joined the Union. The annexation of Texas, which John and Julia Tyler supported, was an example of manifest destiny. Next slide, please. As this is a program of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, I want to say something about the wives of presidents who preceded Julia Tyler. Much as the United States transitioned from the elite age of the early republic to the common man era, famous and celebrated founding mothers, including Martha Washington, the wife of President George Washington, and Abigail Adams, the wife of President John Adams, were followed by lesser-known wives, daughters, and daughters-in-law of presidents of the antebellum era. As women became increasingly confined to the private sphere, so too were first ladies of the antebellum era, generally less visible publicly, although Julia Tyler was an exception. Next slide, please. Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison, served as First Lady from 1809 to 1817, before Julia Tyler was even born. As White House hostess, she provided a space where the official masculine sphere of politics and the unofficial feminine sphere of hostessing interacted, bringing people of differing political persuasions together, even Northerners and Southerners, with the goal of national unity. A widow, Dolly returned to Washington City in 1837 and mentored several presidential wives and other White House hostesses, including Julia Tyler. At the age of 76, Dolly Madison took 24-year-old Julia Tyler, the new bride and the new First Lady of John Tyler, under her wing. Serving as a bridge between the new republic and the antebellum eras, Mrs. Madison graced White House functions during the Tyler administration. I now turn the program over to the Leahys.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Myra, and thank you to Flair for allowing us to be participants in this really interesting project. And we're happy to bring our presentation on Julia Gardiner Tyler. And it represents a portion, next slide, please, of our chapter 6 of our forthcoming biography of First Lady Julia Gardiner Tyler. The title illustrates how closely Julia became married to the annexation of Texas policy after her secret wedding to a sitting U.S. president. I became interested in Julia when Christopher was working on his 2020 biography of President Tyler, President Without a Party. He asked me to transcribe some of her letters because he couldn't read them. And I know why, because she has the handwriting only a mother can love. But I was able to read them and I transcribed them. And we thought we would do a book with a collection of her edited letters, but we ultimately decided to do a full-scale biography. Next slide, please. So Julia was born when James Monroe was president and the Missouri Compromise had been signed into law, and Maine had entered into the Union as the 23rd state. And she was born on May 4th, 1820, on Gardiner's Island, which is just at the tip of Long Island. And for her early life, she lived in the village of East Hampton. Her father and mother, David and Juliana Gardiner, were financially well off. And Julia benefited from her family's position in New York society and also received a substantial education in New York City, which she fortified with a one-year tour of Europe with her father and sister. Next slide, please. Chris and I found during our research on Julia Gardiner that there's a good deal that's not known about her. And more importantly, there's a lot that is misunderstood or just simply incorrect about the various chronicles of her life. On the right is case in point. Here is the Rose of Long Island lithograph caricature that was published in 1840. My 2018 New York History Journal article, Not a Model, First Lady Julia Gardiner Tyler in the New York City Print Culture, addresses this long-standing error that she agreed to pose for it and that it was an advertisement for a dry goods store in Manhattan. So if you can see at the bottom there, the month that the caricature was published, the artist for the lithograph was thrown in jail and for creating a series of caricatures on several New York City families at the time. So indeed got himself in a good bit of trouble there. And you can see on the left above at the 2021 exhibit of First Ladies at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. You can see it all the way on the left there. It's quite small, so it really would make a rather poor advertisement. Next slide, please. So John Tyler married Julia Gardiner on June 26, 1844 in New York City. It was such a closely guarded secret. It was essentially an elopement. And the happy couple returned to Washington, D.C. And on hearing the news, John Quincy Adams, who was serving as a U.S. congressman at the time and no fan of Tyler, he was a Whig, and President Tyler had thrown the Whig Party into disarray because he kept vetoing all of their legislation. And John Quincy Adams' quote is, he was fairly nauseated by their marriage, and he called it the old fable of January and May, because he was disgruntled by their 30-year age difference, with Tyler being 54 and Julia being only 24. Next slide, please. So the annexation of Texas became President Tyler's main focus. And as this slide shows, he thought it might be, he might be able to use this issue to win a presidential term in his own right in 1844. However, it wasn't to be, because right before he married Julia, the treaty his administration was working on to bring Texas into the Union failed in the Senate, so that went by the wayside. But he married her right at that time. And next slide, please. So let me give you a little background. Tyler's first wife, Letitia, suffered a series of strokes before he became president, and she actually died on September 10th, 1842. So all that time that she was ill, and certainly after her death, he had to use surrogates. And those surrogates were his daughter-in-law, Priscilla Cooper Tyler, and also his daughter, Letitia Tyler Semple. Neither one of those women knew that he was getting married to Julia. So you can imagine their surprise and perhaps chagrin when he shows up in Washington with Julia as his bride. So when he brought Julia back to Washington, D.C., Washington was just flush with energy and excitement about it, because essentially Julia Tyler became the first presidential spouse to serve as White House hostess since Louisa Catherine Adams in 1829. So there's three visualizations I want you to pay attention to on this slide. On the left is Julia Gardiner Tyler's wedding portrait, which was created in 1846 and was finished in 1848. It's about a year and a half after she married Tyler. For the portrait, she wore a diamond feronia on her head to honor her late father, who had given her the diamond set. But on her wedding day, she actually had a wreath of orange blossoms in her hair. And it was just like Queen Victoria, which you see here on the right, that she had on her wedding day, because Julia was obsessed with Queen Victoria. And just note the newspaper accounts. I loved reading those. They kept referring over and over again. Every article you would read about this wedding: treaty ratified, Tyler annexed Miss Gardiner, the domestic treaty, over and over again. And these images and words directly link her wedding, their wedding, to the Texas annexation. And that secret marriage to a U.S. president during an extraordinarily contentious political battle made worldwide news. And the visualization of this wedding provided that metaphorical nourishment that the New York City print culture capitalized on. And Chris is going to share with you more on that. Next slide, please.
Okay, well, as Sharon has indicated, the newspapers really had quite a field day with Julia and John Tyler's marriage, but they weren't the only ones. The lithography trade, which had largely matured by 1844, part of the media explosion that Liz mentioned at the outset of the program, lithography had emerged as part of the second party system. The second party system refers to the political combat between the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. And political caricatures, as they were called, that was the terminology that they used at the time, had been used in presidential politics going all the way back to 1824. But it wasn't until the 1840s that the lithography trade really matured, and that people actually came to expect that lithographers, caricaturists, political cartoonists would do their best to try to make all the issues of a particular presidential campaign very much public, for public consumption. So this is actually quite within the realm of the explosion of media and print. Like the newspapers, the lithographers pounced on the couple as well. And for our purposes here, political caricatures offer us another lens through which to view the presidential election of 1844. We think that scholars have ignored their real significance. We treat these lithographs as important primary sources, and our analysis will look at both the source itself, but the lithography itself, as well as the background of the artists. Before I begin to explain this particular slide, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we have the dates for the slide, for the lithograph, for the caricature in the bottom right-hand corner and highlights. So the chronology is important to see how all of this built on the previous ones. The first lithographic political caricature to portray Julia Tyler as the personification of Texas annexation is shown here. The caricature was published by a man named James S. Bailey on the very day of the Tyler-Gardiner wedding. Virtuous Harry features a woman playing the part of Texas, dressed suspiciously like Julia Gardiner on her wedding day. Bailey, or perhaps his partner H. Buckholzer, places a bridal wreath of flowers in the woman's hair, similar to that which Julia Gardiner wore. I want to also call attention to the brooch that's on the middle of her dress. We have a letter from Julia in 1844 where she's describing what she called her diamond star pin that she wore on her dress. So there are some aspects of this particular lithograph that might have, and probably did in fact, use some actual details from her wedding day. The woman here, Julia, Texas, turns away from the Whig nominee for president, Henry Clay, who is Virtuous Harry, who's known as Harry of the West, and offers her hand to the Democrat, James K. Polk. James K. Polk had been nominated by the Democratic Party in 1844 and had made Texas annexation part of the Democratic Party platform. He enthusiastically supported it. And he says that Texas, this woman, was a perfect match for the land of the brave and the home of the free. The dialogue attributed to Clay on the caricature alludes to his reputation for fast living, as he denounces the woman by declaring, "Do you think we will have anything to do with gamblers, horse racers, and licentious profligates?" That is, the very types of people who favor the annexation of Texas. And to be honest, the very types of people that Henry Clay hung around with while he was in Washington. On the other side of Clay is a Quaker minister who admonishes the candidate that his scandalous language will prevent religious folk from voting for him. This may be Bailey's way of introducing Clay's running mate, Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, a man placed on the Whig ticket to appeal to evangelical voters. The effectiveness of the caricature lies in how current events and political maneuvers were weaved into the image. Bailey realized that even though Tyler's Texas treaty had failed in the Senate, that the issue of Texas annexation was still very much alive, and he wanted to capitalize on it. One might ask whether Bailey's timeliness in portraying Texas as a young woman who resembled Julia Gardiner on her wedding day was mere coincidence. The answer requires us to dig a little more deeply into the lithography trade and into Bailey's personal story. To start, a skilled lithographer required very little time to produce caricatures such as Virtuous Harry. Bailey had emigrated from the United Kingdom several years earlier and had actually been a lithographer since 1838. So he was no novice in the trade, knew what to do, knew exactly how to get things done pretty quickly. And since he plied his trade in New York City, it is not unreasonable to imagine that he had heard news of the president's marriage, and soon after the event took place, he hastened to his studio where either he or Buckholzer sketched the image that became Virtuous Harry. Bailey intended to strike fast. His lithograph would hit the streets just as the New York Daily Herald newspaper carried a 2-column story of the president's wedding on June 27th. Timeliness was very important. A Whig in his partisan orientation, Bailey published some 34 caricatures during the 1844 election campaign, most that demonstrated his deep antipathy for President Tyler and for his project of Texas annexation. Taking his personal feelings toward the president into account and linking them with what was surely a typically negative view of Tyler's January and May fabled marriage to Julia Gardiner, it becomes apparent that employing the First Lady as a symbol for Texas allowed Bailey to heap scorn on the president, on his First Lady, and on Texas annexation all at once. The motif employed by the lithograph would have resonated with the political class in Washington and with those people who followed the news. The trick for a political caricaturist was to capitalize on current events and to translate that into sales of his work. Bailey no doubt knew that he had tapped a rich vein by chronicling the personal and political life of John Tyler and by representing Texas as a woman, a particular woman, the First Lady of the United States. Next slide, please. Bailey persisted in using his gender motif as the 1844 campaign unfolded. On July 10th, he published a lithograph entitled Cleansing the Aegean Stable, which was itself a popular metaphor for getting rid of political corruption, as if that could actually be done. This depicts Clay and other notable Whigs ridding the White House of Democrats such as Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, who Bailey clearly conveyed had made a mess of the place. As the Whig nominee in 1844, Clay has the honor of barring James K. Polk from entry. A woman, Texas, shown there on the left, resembles the president's bride, Julia, and she is dressed as she was in Virtuous Harry. She is being unceremoniously kicked out of the People's House, literally by Henry Wise, who wants nothing to do with the debts that the United States would incur upon Texas annexation. What is most significant for our purposes, however, is that Julia again plays the central role in the political caricature, the part of Texas. She wears a gown similar to the one she wore in the first Bailey lithograph, and the same wreath of flowers adorns her hair. But there are some differences. The dress is rumpled, suggesting long use, long wear. Her face is not quite as young and beautiful as it was in the previous lithograph, suggesting that as the annexation issue aged and was revealed in better light, it became less attractive to everyone who saw it. Next slide, please. Now, this is my favorite lithograph that Bailey completed during the campaign of 1844. On the very next day, from Cleansing the Aegean Stable, Bailey published Polk and Company Going Up Salt River with President Tyler. You can see the arrow pointing to President Tyler and his famously long nose, which John Quincy Adams also made fun of a lot in his diary, represented as the masthead in front of a less than seaworthy dinghy that carried prominent pro-annexation Democrats such as Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk, who is shown here in the back of the dinghy as a rooster. The dinghy is being towed by a steamer named Ballot Box. Now, going up the Salt River was a popular political phrase that meant a candidate was headed for sure defeat and political oblivion, which obviously is what Bailey was hoping for Polk in 1844. A closer examination of this lithograph reveals Bailey's ingenuity. On the end of the steamer, seemingly within grasp of both Van Buren and Tyler, Martin Van Buren is shown sitting in the front of the dinghy, stands a cabbage in the shape of a rose. The reference is a double entendre. During the 1840 campaign, when Van Buren was running for re-election against William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, the Whigs proclaimed that they were going to vanquish Van Buren and send him back to his farm in New York where he could raise cabbages. For a time, he was also a potential Democratic candidate for a potential nominee of the Democratic Party for president in 1844. Presenting the cabbage in the form of a rose, however, conveys its significance to President Tyler. As we have already seen, Sharon showed you the Rose of Long Island lithograph that Alfred E. Baker published in May of 1840, which was meant to embarrass the 20-year-old Julia Gardiner, who had been nicknamed the Rose of Long Island by an admirer. So the rose, by inserting the rose into the lithograph in July 1844, and by showing Tyler in hot pursuit, James Bailey adapted the work of Baker to help him make a political statement about the presidential election. And this is something else that the lithography trade really engaged in. You would have lithographers build on the work of other lithographers if they knew that a particular image or a particular concept had actually penetrated the public consciousness. So what he's doing here, what Bailey is doing here, particularly for a New York audience, is to hearken back to the Rose of Long Island lithograph that was published by Alfred E. Baker. Next slide, please. Bailey continued his assault on the Democratic Party's desire for annexation in a lithograph published on July 24th, 1844, and he reinforced the motif of his earlier efforts. Maddie meeting the Texas question. Okay, Maddie refers to Martin Van Buren. In this caricature, the woman portraying Texas is being carried on a platform, a party platform, if you will, hoisted by Thomas Hart Benton on the left and John C. Calhoun on the right. If you look at the lithograph, you can see that Texas is grotesque. The inevitable has come to pass, and she is no longer a beautiful young bride. The wreath of flowers that adorned her hair has dried up and resembles a nest of snakes on Medusa's head. Her face is weathered and ugly. Worse, though she still wears the dress around her waist, she now bears two misshapen breasts, a sight that causes Martin Van Buren to shriek, "Take any other shape but that, and my firm nerve shall never tremble." To add to the negative image of Texas, the female monster is shown clutching a dagger in her right hand that is aimed at the heart of democracy, as well as shackles for enslaved people in her left. And this clearly indicates the sectional aspect, the slavery aspect of Texas annexation that was beginning to make the annexation issue a problem for a lot of politicians. Unbowed and steadfast to his party's goal of annexation, you see James K. Polk over there on the right, telling George Dallas, his running mate, that Texas is not the handsomest lady I ever saw, but the $25,000 a year, meaning the presidential salary, it's worth a little stretching of conscience. Next slide, please. Bailey's conclusion for the saga of Julia Tyler in Texas was published on August 23rd, 1844, 2 days after John Tyler formally announced his withdrawal from the campaign, and the timing is significant. In foot race, Pennsylvania Avenue stakes $25,000. The president is shown at a crossroads. In one direction, off in the distance, stands the White House. In the other direction is Texas. Shuffling in that direction with her back to Tyler is an attractive young woman in a fine dress carrying a parasol. Tyler proclaims that he is used up in the race, meaning he's not going to be able to run for president, and signals his intention to give up his quest for election in his own right so that he can make haste for the young woman who is clearly Julia Tyler. Tyler will eventually accomplish the annexation of Texas by joint resolution right before he leaves office. Tyler asks a farmer leaning on the fence in front of him to tell him the identity of the woman who is hastening up the road there. "Oh, that's the Gardiner daughter," the farmer replies, as the caricature cleverly spells Julia's maiden name differently, perhaps in a half-hearted effort to keep James S. Bailey from being prosecuted for libel. It's also worth pointing out, I think, that now what lithographers are doing is they are bringing women who are married to politicians into the public sphere, into the trade, not quite going so far as to specifically point them out, but leaving enough hints to make sure that everybody knew to whom they were referring. The caricature makes the connection between Julia Tyler and Texas explicit. The road she travels along is labeled Texas, indicating that the theme Bailey employed throughout the summer of 1844 consciously linked the First Lady with the pursuit of annexation. Tyler intends to proceed towards his goal, which he now saw as a legacy issue, even as he acknowledges he cannot secure another 4 years in the White House. The caricature also cleverly reprises the Rose of Long Island motif. You can see the Rose of Long Island there in the inset on the right, by having Julia hold her parasol in exactly the same manner that is tilted forward to shield her face, as she was shown doing by Alfred Baker 4 years earlier. So all of this is building on what had come before. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of Julia Gardiner late in life. You can see the cameo that she wore often around her neck, a brooch of her late husband, John Tyler. It did not take Julia long to become aware that she had been linked in the public mind with Texas. Late in her life, she referenced a poem in the newspaper, the Daily Madisonian, claiming that she had not forgotten the amusement I felt to see my name connected with Texas annexation. Well, old age had apparently softened her memory, for during the campaign of 1844, when she was a newly married First Lady, Julia acknowledged that the association with the unpopular policy of annexation, as well as the unpopular husband, was taking a toll. So what she did is she sought favorable press to counter the negative publicity that James S. Bailey had created with his caricatures. At one point, she even pleaded with her mother, who was back in New York, to see to it that the New York newspapers reported that Julia would be traveling north with Dolly Madison prior to the election of 1844. When Dolly Madison informed Julia that she could not make the trip, Julia insisted to her mother that she include the story anyway. So desperate was she to be associated with Dolly Madison to try to generate more favorable press, very consciously trying to do this. Julia Tyler outwardly projected that she had suffered no permanent damage from her experiences with political caricatures during the 1844 campaign. But the proliferation of provocative lithography throughout the summer had left an indelible mark on her reputation, on the election, and on American politics. During the campaign, the New York Daily Herald pointed out that our principal sheets are filled with ludicrous caricatures of the several candidates for presidential office. What a target a man becomes, the paper said, whenever he enters his list as a presidential candidate. The Herald could easily have commented about what a target a woman becomes when she marries a presidential candidate during a campaign. President Tyler's marriage to Julia Gardiner launched a concerted effort by the print media and lithographers to connect his bride to the administration's goal to annex Texas. The unmistakable sectional overturns of the drive to bring Texas into the Union and annexation's implications for slavery made First Lady Julia Gardiner Tyler a vehicle for print culture and political caricaturists. Julia Tyler was a consequential First Lady. Again, she was the first of these women to have her image and her name attached to a major policy initiative of her husband's. She was also the first to construct a specific and pointed approach to the press, following the maxim that you had to hit back once the press attacked you. She didn't always do it as aggressively as the press did, but she made comments nonetheless. She would follow this maxim beyond her White House years. Probably the best example of that was her letter to the Duchess of Sutherland that she wrote in 1853 in response to wealthy British women imploring American women to put pressure on their slaveholder husbands to end the institution of slavery. So Julia Gardiner Tyler had learned some valuable lessons during that campaign of 1844. Thank you very much for your attention. I guess we'll open it up for questions now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharon and Chris, for your excellent presentation on Julia Tyler. And thank you, Flair, for sponsoring this program. At this point in the presentation, the Leahys will welcome your questions. And I will start out with my own question, which is, Sharon, you mentioned that you became interested in Julia Tyler while Chris was writing his book, President Without a Party. So I'd like to know, Chris, what piqued your interest in John Tyler?
Well, my book, President Without a Party, came about as an outgrowth of my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation at LSU. And I guess, way back when I first began looking for a topic, I was just fascinated by the notion that an American president could actually be kicked out of his own party. And I was interested to find out, how that dynamic really evolved and how it could actually happen. So that really, really became the germ for my interest.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what was Julia Tyler's relationship with other First Ladies? And did she mentor any of her successors as Dolly Madison had mentored her?
Well, in 1878, President Rutherford B. Hayes and his wife Lucy invited her to a reception. And a reporter approached her, and she said that she felt like Dolly Madison that night, because she said that when she was First Lady, she always remembered to invite Dolly Madison to every single reception that she had. So while I don't exactly call that mentoring, I'm sure that Lucy Rutherford, when she read that in the newspapers the next day, I'm sure she felt somewhat schooled by it. So that was just her very interesting way to mentor other First Ladies.
Thank you. We do have another question, which is, so how would you assess Julia Tyler's overall handling of the press? Did public opinion support her, or was she seen in a negative light?
I actually think she did a pretty remarkable job of at least trying to manage the press and, trying to generate positive publicity for herself, if you will. She was actually involved in the White House with trying to get favorable impressions of the Tyler administration itself out into the public sphere. So she, I guess, in some ways regarded part of her job as trying to do the best that she possibly could personally for her husband and for his administration. And I think she was rather surprised that she was the focal point, or the press and the lithographers made such a big deal about her being a focal point for Texas annexation. So I think she had to pivot a little bit and make sure that she then started thinking about her own role in the whole process. Obviously, this is uncharted territory. She had experience dealing with the press. And in fact, I think that's one of the recurring themes of her life, is that, the press did play a role in her life from beginning to end. But as I said at the end of the program, I think she really did a good job of translating some of the lessons that she had learned in 1844 to other aspects of her life and other parts of her life.
Okay. Thank you. And there's another question, which is, are you aware of other prominent women of the antebellum era, including other presidential wives and White House hostesses, who are caricatured in lithographs? And if so, please give some examples.
Well, there are other women, other politically connected women who were caricatured. One of the, I guess, most egregious examples occurred in 1835 when Julia Chin, who was Richard M. Johnson's common law wife, a woman of mixed ancestry, was caricatured by the anti-democratic press as he was running for election. Martin Van Buren was running for election. Richard M. Johnson was his vice presidential running mate. They were running for the offices in 1836, and Julia Chin became the subject of a particularly nasty caricature. DeWitt Clinton's wife at one point had been caricatured. There was an incident at Saratoga in upstate New York. There was a popular spa resort and place where a lot of politicians found themselves in the late summer of every year. And Mrs. Clinton did what they called cut, which was basically look at somebody and turn her head really quickly. She cut Martin Van Buren, and the press actually glorified this. For some reason, it seems like Martin Van Buren was not really all that much beloved by the press. So the press caricatured DeWitt Clinton's wife, but also used the opportunity in the caricature to make fun of Martin Van Buren. So there are other examples of other women who were part of these caricatures, who were part of the lithography trade. But to our knowledge, Julia was the first lady to actually have this happen to her.
Great. Fascinating. Thank you. Another question is, can you say more about why the press associated her with Texas?
Well, I think the the connection between Tyler's marriage and the terminology of annexation and concluding a treaty, and some of the newspaper articles that Sharon highlighted in her portion of the program, it's almost like they couldn't help themselves but to deliver pun after pun. And it just seemed a natural progression that if the newspapers were looking at the marriage and connecting it, literally connecting it, semantically connecting it to annexation, that the lithography trade would then take that and run with it as well. So I think it almost progressed right from the very clever or not so clever puns that were being introduced by the newspapers, and the lithography trade really worked and even went beyond what the newspapers were doing in that regard.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That segues nicely into the next question, which is, besides the caricatures of Julia Tyler as a symbol of Texas, what other interesting or surprising discoveries have you made about her?
Well, I would just say that all of her interactions with the press is really extraordinary for a woman at that time. Women just did not engage proactively with the press, and she did her whole life. And she was very, she was very used to, she read lots and lots of newspapers every day. If someone walked into her house, they'd see just newspapers and periodicals scattered all over the place. She was a real news hound, and she did not hold back when she had an opinion that she wanted to get out to the American public. So that really surprised us. So that's one of the things that I think we have been really good at documenting that behavior.
Yes, you have been. It's very interesting discovery, I think, about the caricatures and all. Then next question, what did the Tylers think of the Mexican-American War, which followed the annexation of Texas?
Well, John Tyler was supportive of the war. He was a little bit critical of some of the things that James K. Polk did in prosecuting the war. I think Tyler certainly regarded the Mexican War as an outgrowth, at least partial outgrowth, of the annexation policy that he pursued. I don't necessarily say that he predicted war, but he did meet with Polk very early on in the war. He had gone back to Washington, D.C. Actually, in the midst of a scandal, he had to appear before a couple of congressional committees to defend his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, who was being accused of malfeasance in using what was known as the Secret Service Fund during the Webster-Ashburton Treaty negotiations. So Tyler was back in Washington. He had dinner with James K. Polk, with President Polk, and the recently recalled minister to Mexico, a guy from Louisiana named John Slidell, senator from Louisiana. And again, he was supportive of the war in the sense that he believed that American honor would be at stake. I think he was certainly pleased with the way that Polk, in effect, almost aggressively pursued war. Tyler really had no problem with that. Julia wasn't so much, wasn't really vocal on the Mexican War, didn't really speak, certainly didn't write anything about it or didn't publish anything about it. Tyler actually had a bit of a personal connection to the Mexican War because both of his elder sons, Robert, the eldest son, and John Jr., also had a connection to the Mexican War, at least very tangentially for a brief period of time. Robert organized a militia company in Philadelphia that disbanded pretty soon after it started. And John Jr. had actually purchased a commission to the U.S. Army, but resigned that commission towards the end of the war. So I think Tyler was a little bit worried that his sons might end up on the shooting end of the Mexican-American War, but it ended up not happening, not turning out that way.
Yeah, that's fortunate for them, I think. Next question is, did Julia Tyler remain pro-slavery throughout her life, even after the Civil War, or did she modify her support for it?
Well, the Duchess of Sutherland letter is an interesting episode in her life. She felt, I think, put upon that the wealthy women of Britain would criticize the South and criticize the slaveholding South And one of the things that she pointed to was her time in Ireland. When she was 19 years old, 20 years old, she had gone to Europe with her parents and her sister, and they had spent some time in Ireland, and she was aghast at the way the British had allowed Ireland to devolve here by 1840. So she was basically, in the sense of, thinking about it in terms of, you have a lot of your own problems, do not interfere with ours. Her husband certainly believed that he wanted no interference from Britain, especially, but from the North either, with respect to the slavery question. So, Julia took on that mantle. She did abide by that. As far as what happens after the Civil War, Julia never becomes part of the lost cause mythology. She, does not have any time for that, did not pursue anything connected to that, like Daughters of the Confederacy or any group like that. And it was almost as if she said, well, this is what happened. This is how history, this is the hand that history has dealt. So I just have to adapt to that. And that's another thing that we have found in our research, is that she was very adaptable. In some ways, this might not be considered a positive, in the sense that she could adapt to the slave system once she married Tyler and moved to Virginia. But I think in some ways, too, her adaptability also allowed her to survive things that might have shaken her otherwise.
Thank you. And do you have a publisher for your Julia Tyler biography? And if so, when do you anticipate the biography will be published?
Yes, we do. It's the University Press of Kansas, and we anticipate it being published towards the end of 2023 or early 2024. So stay tuned.
Great. We'll look out for the new book then. And then finally, like I learned from reading President Without a Party, that you were invited to Sherwood Forest, the Tyler plantation, for Thanksgiving. And what was your experience there?
Yeah, Harrison Tyler, John Tyler's grandson, invited Sharon and me to Thanksgiving dinner. It was an interesting experience. We've always enjoyed our time with the Tylers. They actually served lamb chops. So we thought it was interesting that, at least for that particular Thanksgiving, and I don't think they did it just because we showed up, they decided not to serve the standard fare of turkey and stuffing, but lamb chops instead. But it was a terrific time. It was a terrific experience eating in the same dining room where Julia and John Tyler and their family ate.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Painey Tyler, his wife, Harrison's wife, had researched a lot of the furnishings and decorating that Julia had done. So she had really made the dining room to be exactly the way it was, with the same wallpaper and everything. So it really, we were kind of pinching ourselves, and of course they were just having dinner.
Right. They're used to dining amidst history.
Right.
I guess so. Well, thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I'm now pleased to turn the program back over to the president of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, Dr. Myra Guten.
Thank you, Liz. We do have a minute or two before we say goodnight for the evening. And I'm wondering, Sharon and Chris, are there any concluding comments that you might like to make? And if not, that's okay.
Well, just that we are hard at work trying to finish up the book manuscript, and we look forward to putting this project to bed, hopefully soon.
Yeah, and the comment I would just like to make is, I just think that I know when I went into this project, I thought that there was everything that needed to be known about Julia Tyler was already known. But what we found out was that there was an enormous amount of primary sources out there that had never been touched. And I am just really excited to share this work with the historical community and anybody that's interested in First Ladies, because that is an untapped avenue of research. And I hope that there's more historians out there or people interested in First Ladies that want to do that research, because they are very fascinating people. They They are the first-hand witnesses to some really important things in our history. So that is my closing thoughts.
Well, thank you. And I can tell you that all of us are looking forward to your book. And thank you, Liz and Sharon and Chris, for really a wonderful, enlightening program tonight. To our viewers, wherever you are, if you are not members of FLAIR and you'd like to join us, please go to our website. It's FLAIR, FLARE-net.org. I'd also like to share with everyone that in February and March of this year, FLAIR is going to be combining with the Dole Institute for Politics at the University of Kansas in 4 separate presentations. We'll have more information available for you in the weeks ahead, but I can tell you that we're very glad for this collaboration and look forward to sharing with everyone. Thank you again, everyone, for listening. We wish you a good night, and we'll have more programs in 2023. Thank you very much.